Thank you all for joining us in these unusual circumstances, but we appreciate it. Glad you all could make it. The Columbian is pleased to welcome candidates for congressional representative from Washington's 3rd District. I am Greg Jane. I'm the editorial page editor, and I will we'll let the editorial board members introduce themselves. We'll start with Craig.
Hi, I'm Craig Brown. I'm the editor of the Columbian.
Ben Campbell, publisher.
Jody Campbell, editorial board.
Scott Campbell, newly retired publisher and now chairman of the board.
And then Callie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Callie Hare. I cover politics for the Columbian, and I will be reporting on this meeting, but not participating.
So great. And one last piece of housekeeping. You guys have been through this before. You probably know we are recording this. We will post it unedited on our YouTube channel and for the benefit of our readers and people in the community. So since we have that out of the way, now to the important part. We'll get to the candidates. Go ahead and take 1 to 2 minutes, introduce yourselves and give us a brief explanation of why you are running for this office. And after that, we'll move on to specific policy issues. And we'll start with Carolyn.
Sure, my name is Carolyn Long, Democrat running for Washington's 3rd Congressional District. I am like many people here in Southwest Washington, somebody who grew up in rural communities all of my life. I worked at my dad's store, John's Fresh Produce, from the age of 12. It was tough, but we got by because we were well connected to the community and we came together as a family. Learned the produce skill, which helped me when I got a job at Safeway after high school, starting out as a courtesy clerk and then working my way up to a journeyman. Proud member of UCW Local 555. I had a family wage job at age 20 that helped pay for college. Went off to graduate school and then have been teaching here at Washington State University, Vancouver for the last 25 years. You know, I've been privileged to teach mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons of the same family over this quarter century. And also very proud of the work I've done in the community, bringing people together to talk about difficult issues in a way that's civil and also productive. And I'm running because I think that Southwest Washington has been left behind. And I'm somebody present, accountable, and committed to working hard every day to earn the support of the people of the district. We'll talk about these issues, but obviously affordable access to health care and prescription drug relief, as well as smart investment of infrastructures and protecting the environment and getting money out of politics are my main issues. And I thank you so much for doing this. It's one of the rare opportunities you see candidates together, and I hope there will be future ones as well.
Great, thank you. And Jamie.
Thank you. I'm Jaime Herrera Beutler. I get to represent this region in Congress. And the reason I'm running is because I am uniquely qualified to help Southwest Washington through what is a difficult and unpredictable time. You know, we're a unique region. There's not one dominant industry or one dominant way of thinking. We're made up of small employers who span just about every industry you can imagine. And our interests span the spectrum as well. You can't just plug and play representative here. It takes time to learn all the nooks and crannies, to understand the needs here, to know who to call and how to help to get things done. You know, I definitely have my principles and I don't violate them. But I have never approached this job with an ideological axe to grind. I truly just believe that government needs to serve the people, just needs to function, and it needs to serve the people here. This is an election year, and no, it's unpredictable, but no matter what happens, I have proven that I can work with people from all political stripes to solve problems for people here, whether it's saving our salmon, getting every member of the Washington-Oregon delegation to support my bipartisan legislation, or getting the ACE Kids Act passed and have this president sign it into law, getting low-income kids access to health care. Look, you know, with COVID, it's impossible to predict when we're going to return to normal, but it is so clear to me that we absolutely need to save as many jobs as possible and protect businesses like never before. Families, individuals are going to need additional economic relief. There is no doubt about that. And we must do everything in our power to protect the health of our residents. So I've never taken my eye off the ball. I'm going to fight tooth and nail to get our economy moving, get workers through this. But there are also other major issues I'm looking forward to talking about: combating maternal mortality, protecting our hydro resources, childcare, And those are all things that haven't waned in importance as the COVID crisis has come. So I've proven I can get things done on this and other issues. I was rated #1 by the Center for Effective Lawmakers out of all 10 Washington representatives and the 2 senators as the most effective lawmaker in Washington. I know these are extremely challenging times, but I have always risen to the challenges for folks here. I have the energy to continue to fight, and I'm ready to keep serving this region in Congress.
Great, thank you. And again, thanks to both of you for joining us. You both mentioned that things are difficult. These are unprecedented times. So far, how would you assess Congress's response to the coronavirus pandemic? And what should be the next steps? How should Congress approach this? And let's start with Jaime.
Well, I think that we're not out of this, so we're kind of still in the middle, building this plane as we're flying it. You know, in March, we joined in a bipartisan way to pass legislation both to give relief to workers through unemployment benefits and relief to businesses in an unprecedented fashion. In fact, we were able to get the PPP loans put together and through the Small Business Administration, not without issue, but I think we got them to do more loans in 14 days than they had done in the previous 14 years. And what has that meant for Southwest Washington? Well, 9,000 employers here have been able to survive. They've been able to continue on. 90,000 jobs have been saved here. That's unprecedented. Now, like I said, we're still pushing over this huge hurdle. So I think it's going to take, like I said, more economic relief for residents here, more work or more protections for workers, and more help for small businesses. And I actually believe at this time, now more than ever, we have to decrease the cost of healthcare. It's one of the reasons I crossed party lines in December as one of 2 Republicans to vote to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. And I had to laugh because during that time, Big Pharma actually ran ads against me in December because I voted against, their cardinal bill. But I felt like when they were hitting me on that, it made me think I'm in the right place here because we're going to lower the cost of insulin, for example, for folks here in Southwest Washington. And now, as people are getting squeezed more than ever, I think it's even more salient to make sure, really to make sure we're doing all we can.
And one thing I think that most people agree with, or at least understand, the reason for the expenditures from Congress. But in the long run, once we get past this, how do we pay for all of that?
Well, I think there's 2 pieces here. Government is the one that stepped in and said to employers here. So we had a booming economy. We were at all-time lows in most categories, and certainly in the last decade in Southwest Washington, among people of color, among people with disabilities. I mean, every category you could think of. So we were in an amazing place. And then because of the pandemic, the government said, you got to shut down. I mean, it was similar in my mind to an eminent domain situation. And so as kind of compensation, the government and the people have been paying for that extended relief for those single parents in this county. Now, we have to get through this before we shut that spigot off, so to speak, because I think we need to help people pay their mortgage right now because we've caused them to lose their job, right? We need to make sure that they can still afford healthcare. We need to make sure that they still can, put food on the table. However,
in the long run, how does the federal government pay for this?
In the long run, well, so I was getting to that. So the next step and why it's so important to protect small businesses through this is they're the ones that are going to lead us out of this into a recovery. Take the Columbian. I know that they took a PPP loan and they protected their employees in that process. I want you guys to survive because you're a local paper. There are very few, if any, family-run businesses like this, an independent paper in our area that employs folks. We need to see that continue, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's the Neptune movie theater, their surgical training institute in Camas. All of those have reached out and said, you helped us keep our employees from going on unemployment. We're paying them. I think as we get out of this, it's really going to be the small businesses that lead the way. They're the ones that always do in recovery. And so creating a playing field, not just where they can survive, but they can thrive and take us out of this. Hopefully, that will be in the near future. I'm hoping in next year, that's the name of the game. It's how do we move forward? How do we move forward? Not How do we just kind of block and tackle, which is kind of how I feel things have been right now.
Right, and I appreciate that. And I'm sorry, Carolyn, we'll get you in a second. I want to try and nail this down. But the CARES Act, I believe, was for about $2 trillion. And that obviously is not money that was budgeted for. Eventually, how do we pay that back?
Well, our economy has to move again. So before,
right, but once that happens.
Well, so before the pandemic, our economy was bumping around between 3.5% and 4%. We were at record low unemployment, and tax receipts were coming in at record numbers. We were seeing everything from charities continue to get more money, which was all the things people said weren't going to happen. And a large part of that, you and I talk about this, had to do with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which my opponent says she would repeal. Joe Biden says he'd repeal. I don't believe that adding to people's taxes and raising their taxes right now is going to get us out of this. I actually think we're going to need to continue to tailor low affordable energy costs. I talked about protecting our hydro system. Think about SCH, think about the toilet paper crisis, right? We had local manufacturers, pulp and paper workers, who were able to supply those needs because we had that manufacturing capability here in Clark County. Well, right now there are people trying to breach that dam system. There are elected leaders in our state trying to rip that system out. And I think this is one area where it's so important that I maintain my ability to serve here. I'm going to fight extremist ideology that says we have to rip those dams out in order to save and protect our salmon, because it's such a critical need for our economy. Low cost, reliable energy leads to manufacturing. And those are the people and those are the types of jobs that are going to lead us out of this once we allow them to operate again. I mean, right now we're still under orders where most people and most businesses aren't at full capacity. As we phase into that, we have to make sure we're listening to them about energy costs, healthcare costs. Certainly, we can't raise their taxes, which is what my opponent has pledged to do. That's going to make it even worse.
Okay, and actually, I will come back to that, but let's give Carolyn a chance. Carolyn, what are your thoughts on how Congress has addressed this and what else needs to be done?
Sure. So there's a lot here, so I'm going to break it up into some pieces. The first, I want to talk about the response to the healthcare crisis, then the economic crisis. Then I want to speak to the Tax Reform Act and my real position, and also what we need to do moving forward for all of these issues that we're facing. The first thing, if I were a member of Congress, I wouldn't have allowed us to be caught flat-footed when this pandemic hit. People from both parties have cut pandemic relief funding for the last several years, which made us ill-equipped to actually deal with this crisis. And then once we saw it coming to our shores, the executive branch was slow to invoke the Defense Authorization Act to try to deal with the issue of the shortage in testing and the shortage of PPE equipment for our first responders. That is something that should have been done not only immediately, with the leadership provided by the White House, but members of Congress really should have called upon the administration to doing its job to leading us out of this pandemic. What would I have done? Obviously, relief funding that came immediately for frontline workers, it was very, very important. And parts of the CARES Act did work fairly effectively. But we can't take a victory lap with the CARES Act without looking at the tremendous limitations that we also saw with this piece of legislation. There are many small businesses that did benefit from it, and this did save jobs. But we also saw money going to major corporations that didn't need it and, in fact, had to give it back. We saw money going to members of Congress. So there was really a lot of problems with the PPP that should have been anticipated and addressed early on. So I think it's always important that we look at the good and the bad. You know, there's always an excuse that when you have something that you're building mid-air, I think my opponent said we're building the plane as it's flying. We take a look at the plane that's in the hangar right now, and we learn from what has happened in the past, and we try to fix those problems. So in terms of public health, obviously we have to prioritize that through federal funding. We need leadership from the White House, and we need members from both parties to hold this administration to account to make sure that he's providing the leadership that's necessary. Right now, it's like the Hunger Games still for states trying to find access to equipment and testing, and that's simply irresponsible. I, of course, do favor small businesses. My personal story of being somebody who grew up in a small business knows how important it is But when I see big corporations and $500 billion slush funds that are there where we can't really account where those federal dollars are going, I become concerned about transparency and concerned that the small businesses aren't really getting the assistance that they need. So I think we always have to look at aggressive oversight of the spending of our federal taxpayer dollars. Your money, my money, not Amazon, not Wells Fargo, not big corporations that don't pay taxpayer dollars, but certainly the ones that we pay. So there's more that can be done for the pandemic relief. I'm looking for leadership. It's why our campaign put together materials almost immediately on a county basis to show people where they can get assistance and also where they can volunteer. That brings me to the economic recovery, which is something that we are really focusing on, and which of course is connected to our public health recovery. They're tied together, even though I'm dealing with them separately. You can't have an economic recovery if you have people who are still struggling with a public health crisis. And the first thing that we have to do is recognize that the economic impact of coronavirus has affected all of us differently. It affects people in the urban and suburban areas very differently than it does in our rural communities. If you're working with your hands, if you've got a small store, you can't replace that work by going on Zoom like some of us can in the larger cities. So our economic response has got to be tailored to that, which is why things like the PPP are a good example of things that we can do, but there's so much more. And what I noticed, absent from my opponent's conversation, was how do we move forward now? What I think we have to do is, of course, provide immediate relief for the unemployed. They are at risk of losing money for rent, for paying for their life-saving prescription drugs, for food on the table. So that must be a priority, as well as working families. But it is also so very important when looking at moving forward that we also look ahead at how we can look at the structural problems in our economy, which have just exemplified why this pandemic has been so hard on us economically. So we have to look at those national problems, which I'm going to address in a second. But the worst thing to happen is this continuation of what we see in Washington, D.C., where big corporations are always first at the table with their handout. They've got the connections because they're the ones that are funding the elections of members of Congress. So their voices are heard and not the people of Southwest Washington. So I think there's much more that can be done. And I certainly hope in the next package that Congress deliberates that there is money for state and local government. Federal funding for state and local government contributes to a significant percentage of their budgets. And these are our first responders. They're law enforcement. There are people who are in our fire departments. There are people who are providing the services we meet with every single day. I want to talk about debt, Greg, because we talked about it 2 years ago. And we were told 2 years ago that the Republican tax plan was going to pay for itself, and that it was spurring the economy. And we're hearing today that the economy was booming, I think the word was, but that is not the case. Oftentimes people look at a rising stock market and they look at low unemployment and they think the economy is doing great. But the reality is the stock market is not a good barometer of economic health, and nor, frankly, is the unemployment rate if you've got people working minimum wage jobs in multiple jobs just so that they can pay their rent. But the other thing that we were told 2 years ago was that tax bill was going to pay for itself. And what did we learn? We learned that within a year, $1 trillion was added to the federal debt. That's money that my daughter's going to pay for and my granddaughter or grandson are going to pay for. And why is that important? Because those cuts went to major corporations and the wealthiest Americans, and small businesses and working class folks got a break, but it was nothing compared to the vast majority of the dollars that were spent. And so let me correct the Congresswoman on this point. I have said repeatedly that we need to reform the tax bill with an eye towards placing working families and small businesses first, rather than major corporations. You build up major corporations who fund congressional campaigns, and that is when small businesses are always at risk. And that is precisely what we're seeing here today. So reform is not let's tax everyone. Reform is let's have a fair tax where we're treating Main Street better than we're treating Wall Street.
Now, Jamie, did the tax cuts pay for themselves?
So Greg, we've talked about this one. It hasn't. We talked about the whole 10 years and not being able to pay for themselves in the first year. But yes, they were already bringing in last year. Listen, let me finish. They were already bringing in last year more than was expected, and they were beginning to pay for themselves. That's what happens when someone on the lower socioeconomic rung of the ladder is able to get a job and then decide, you know what, this job isn't good enough for me, and leave that job and go to another job, which is something that they've finally been able to do. I mean, our economy in Southwest Washington, of course, is always going to need to be able to move forward, but it was the best it had been in a decade as a direct result of the work that I had taken. Let me correct a few things that my opponent has brought up. You know, she said that she just wants to reform the tax code. She said in the last election that she, quote, hates it and would repeal the whole thing. Do you know what that means? That the average family in Clark County would immediately have to pay an additional $2,300 a year. She would immediately jack up taxes on them. The vice president, who's running for president now, has said something similar, and that will cost us almost 600,000 jobs. And the irony is, as they go to increase those taxes, they haven't said they're going to pay down the debt. She talks about her daughter's debt. Boy, I'm concerned about the same thing. I have kids, and I don't want my grandkids to be paying forever for what we're seeing now. However, she isn't going to use the increase in taxes to pay down the debt. She's going to use it to pad the reelection efforts of members of Congress to the tune of $5 million of public funding a year. She would support insurance company bailouts to the tune of $10 billion a year.
Now,
I mean,
hold on, we're getting off track a little. I think the question is.
She also has said she supports a $32 trillion.
We'll get to healthcare. We'll get to healthcare later.
But no, we did this last time, Greg. I have to finish this point because the economy is over a sixth of, or healthcare is over a sixth of the economy, and so to take a
okay, Jamie, we'll get to healthcare later. That's a different issue.
Say, if we're talking about paying down the debt, we have to take into account those types of spending. Okay,
and we'll get to healthcare later. Now, but even before the pandemic, the federal budget was on pace for a deficit this year of almost $1 trillion. How were the tax cuts paying for themselves? You're saying they were beginning to pay for themselves. They were enacted more than 3 years ago, and the deficit this year was already going to be $1 trillion. Now, it's been exacerbated by the coronavirus. That's understandable. But why was it already going to be $1 trillion or darn near $1 trillion?
Well, so let's talk about this for a second. When you let the average family in Southwest Washington keep $2,300 more of their money a year,
why was the deficit already going to be $1 trillion?
This is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. If the IRS counted that money as money it got to spend, when you let the family keep it, yeah, the IRS is going to have a hole in its budget. But the reality is from last year, the last year that we actually have the tax receipts available, they were bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars more as a result of a racing economy. 6 million new jobs, right?
Why
and for people on the lower end. I don't know which one of those things you want to take back.
During a racing economy, why was the deficit already going to be $1 trillion?
So I just explained it. So if you're going to let that family keep the $2,300 in Clark County, which they pocketed in this last IRS year, that means that the government doesn't get to spend it, the family does. Look, that's how the CBO scores this. But the reality is we were seeing that pumped back into the economy to the tune of hundreds of millions more in tax receipts than the previous decade.
So, Jamie, I'm curious. In 2011, you said if Congress doesn't stop the overspending, America will cease to be the land of opportunity we all know. What has changed? Why did the deficit matter then and it doesn't matter now?
Well, Greg, I don't know if you're willing to give back the PPP loan that helped keep your employees.
No, that's not the question.
We're now to a point, we're in a global pandemic. Well, do you want me to cut off rent assistance? I bring $650,000 of rent assistance to Clark County in Southwest Washington. Do you want me to give that back?
No,
Look, I'm going to say our economy has to move forward. We have to make sure that we're not wasting money. We have to empower individuals, families, and small businesses. And that's why small businesses, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, has endorsed me in this race.
And I don't think anybody disagrees with the need for those things. But I'm having trouble reconciling the argument that we were paying down the deficit that the tax cuts were paying for themselves prior to the pandemic when all evidence suggests otherwise.
That's not true. I just told you that we were bringing in more in tax receipts, hundreds of millions of more than projected. It had started. I don't know. We're going to have to agree to disagree on this again, because I can share with you the tax receipts from the IRS. But, you know, if you're counting the $1 trillion as an over 10-year expenditure, you have to count the payback in an over 10-year expenditure. I just don't know, Greg. I know that you have not liked the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I know that it has not been something.
We've discussed this before.
The people of this district, after I voted for that bill, continue to ask me to serve them in Congress because they saw the economic benefit. They saw the growth in wages at the lowest end of the spectrum, and they saw increasing opportunities for them and their families. I think we're just gonna have to disagree on this one.
Yes, I think that we will, as we have in the past, and I'm sure we will again, and that's okay. But anybody, next question.
Can I jump in, or did you want to wait, Greg?
Real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, just a couple things. One, you know, trickle-down economics has never worked historically, and that's essentially what we were being sold. It was a bill of goods, and it hasn't manifested itself. And I trust the numbers that show that we weren't having this incredible economic recovery. And in fact, what we saw big corporations do, again, the biggest beneficiaries of the tax bill was buy back stocks and give dividends to their shareholders. We didn't see that generate economic growth. So if we're being asked to look at the modest growth, and it is modest, of taxpayers who are taking that $2,300 and putting it back in the economy, it pales in comparison to the amount of money that the wealthiest Americans and big corporations got through that act. And I think that's very important to recognize that. And it's not $1 trillion, it's going to be $2 trillion. And the point I want to make, which is very important, is that $2 trillion debt makes it very difficult for our country to respond responsibly to this pandemic. It's a hole in our sock. And when we put our foot in, we're very concerned that we don't have as much leverage in using federal dollars to deal with a real economic crisis. And finally, Greg, you know, the fact that we had this tax bill take place at a time when the economy was doing fairly well really only served as a political ploy by Republicans to say we're cutting your taxes, and we didn't really see the impact that we thought it would. And frankly, every CBO report that I've read, that I think you have read, has shown that it hasn't paid for itself, is contributed to the debt, and we cannot be misled by somebody looking at other numbers and trying to persuade us otherwise.
I'll say, as Jamie knows, I could discuss this all day, but we should move on. But Craig, you want to jump in?
Do you really want to?
Sure, Greg does like to talk about that all day. That's you should see him on any other Tuesday. So I'm interested in the Black Lives Matter movement and the issue of systemic racism that's been raised. So I'm wondering what you see Congress able to do to kind of address the situation and also help local officials as they try to improve procedures with police and hiring and the economy and all kinds of different things.
Me to go first? Or you want Miss?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think maybe it's Carolyn's turn to go first.
Yeah, I'm fine. First, let me begin by saying Black Lives Matter to me is not a controversial statement. Obviously, Black Lives Matter, and what it does is it captures our attention to the fact that there are institutional and systematic barriers built in for communities of color. So I know that sometimes people get concerned about the term, but I don't find it controversial. I also am here to say that systematic racism, institutional racism obviously exists. It's existed for decades. Sometimes it's intentional, but often it's an unintentional effect of some of the legislation that we pass. So what we need are members of Congress who keep this in mind when they pass legislation. We already know that people of color have a difficult time accessing affordable health care, that it disproportionately affects them. We found with the PPP loans that minority-owned businesses had a more challenging time qualifying for that money because of systemic racism. And so it's a problem that has to be addressed. And I bring a specific skill set to this as a leader in my own community because of the work I've done with my Initiative for Public Deliberation, where I can bring people together to talk about this issue in a way that has us find shared understandings and then, of course, work towards results. So I think that is something that is happening right now, sometimes more effectively in some places than others. But I think we have to always keep our eye out, and we have to do a special job, especially here in the 3rd Congressional District, reaching out to those communities who are affected by these policies and listening and learning and using that understanding to bring back to Congress when we are looking at formulating policy. So I'm really hopeful that we can continue to have these conversations in a productive way. And that we really do pay attention to the unintended consequences of some of the policies that we pass.
Okay, so Jaime, what's your view?
You know, I think racial injustice is real. I think people hit up against it in the system. They hit up against it in communities. Our community is not exempt. You know, when I growing up in this county, I remember my dad laughing once, saying, "We're the only Herreras in the phone book." And I at the time didn't understand what his point was, but I get it now. And now, though, here I also get to say, you know, I'm the first Hispanic American to be elected from Washington State federally by this district. So by and large, I feel like there is an understanding that we need to address racial injustice, and I think Congress has to take it on. You know, I've introduced the Senate Companion to the Justice Act, and part of the goal is to make sure that law enforcement is accountable and transparent to the communities that it serves. We have to find ways to teach, train, and empower law enforcement to de-escalate situations rather than escalate them, because that's how they're trained right now. The training is to escalate and use as much force as possible to stop something. I mean, that's how we're training them. We need to support them and change that. And there are officers in the force who should not be in the force. I have had some of our local police officers observe that, and I've spoken with them and I've worked with them, and we need to move those folks on. But the reality is, I believe a majority of law enforcement officers are there to serve you and me and our community. I do think that calls to defund police are dangerous. I think it could put us on the wrong path. And you know, I've been frustrated when I watch, you know, the protests in Portland or even what's happened in Seattle. They're increasingly violent, and I listen when the NAACP president of Portland says it's become a white spectacle. Man, that's embarrassing. And he's right. It's detracting from the message of racial unity. And I've spoken with leaders in our community, both from law enforcement and from communities of color. And what I'm seeing in Southwest Washington, I feel like it is the right model, because the message is unity. It's not that we're not different. It's not that there aren't problems, but it's I care enough about you. And this is to both, you know, this is both from enforcement and justice from those communities of color, that we want to link arms and move together in understanding so that we can impact the community. Because I think this does happen community by community. You know, I think Congress has to help reset how law enforcement is accountable and the training they get. But I'm really proud of how our community is choosing to move forward. And I wish, when I look at Portland, that the white spectacle would end and we could really focus on ending racial injustice, which was what this organic, real movement began as.
Now, from Congress' standpoint, do you support, I believe there's a bill that would ban chokeholds and that would create a national registry of police who have been disciplined. Are you in favor of that?
Without a doubt. And the legislation I co-authored in the House actually does that. It makes lynching a federal crime. It takes more money in to make sure that we are training police to de-escalate. And I've actually spoken with some experts in this area, and I've spoken to some of our local law enforcement to see if there's a way to really empower officers. Man, these men and women get in this job to serve. Like I said, there are some that need to be removed, but they're fewer. You know, I don't want to brush all of law enforcement with this horrible brush, because it's just not the case. But I think we have to help with the funding, and we have to hold accountable through the training. And that's why I've introduced the Justice Act in the House to do just that.
Yeah, and Carolyn, would you support that bill?
Yes, I would not Herrera Beutler's bill, but there are many things in the other bill that I would support. So I kind of want to come back, because I didn't address the issue of Congress, which I think gets to your question, Greg. And let me make clear that I'm not in favor of defunding the police. I think many Democrats are painted with that brush, and that's simply inaccurate. I had the privilege of doing a ride along with a law enforcement officer in Longview, and I saw firsthand how he had to be a mental and behavioral health specialist, a public safety person, somebody who had to rescue a cat out of a tree, all in the span of 2 hours. And so what I am interested in is how we can make sure that we provide the adequate support for the other types of programs that exist to take some of the pressure off law enforcement for doing things that they are not adequately trained in doing. My opponent talked about the Justice Act, and I would ask that you take a deep look at this act, as well as the alternative provided by the Democrats, because what I see in the Justice Act is a lot of window dressing and a lot of conversation about things that can be done that really don't have any teeth in it. So when you speak about banning chokeholds, when you speak about making sure the Department of Justice can track racial profiling that's existing, and making sure that you hold law enforcement who go astray to account, when you talk about the things that really will make a difference, like community policing, that isn't in the Justice Act. So I would ask that we look at the two bills that are in Congress. I am not in favor of everything that is in the Democrats' bill, but it certainly has more teeth, dealing with the issue of demilitarization of the police, as well as de-escalation tactics, because I think we need to have something that works. And like everyone, I have been pleased to see that in Southwest Washington, we have had generally very peaceful protests with an eye towards having a conversation about these very real issues affecting our community, and that there are instances in other cities where it's been less peaceful, and nobody is in favor of looting, nobody's in favor of vandalism, and so with that, I think we can all agree today.
Now, along those lines, Jaime, were you in favor when the president sent federal law enforcement into Portland?
You know, as a Republican and someone who supports the Constitution, part of the reason we didn't have a big national federal law enforcement is because this is the type of thing that states need to be in charge of. I actually voted to require any president or any executive who wants to send law enforcement to a state that they make that they report to Congress and they give the rationale. I was one of a handful of Republicans to do this. In fact, it's funny, I convinced many of the moderate Democrats chose not to support this, but I don't, it's the same requirement that you would have if we were sending the military overseas into war. You have to notify Congress, you have to provide a justification. Well, in my mind, if we're talking about the constitutional rights of Americans, you can't have vans, unmarked vans, pulling people into them. That's unacceptable to me. Having said that, do I wish that Portland would have done more to stop the violent protests? Absolutely. Again, I think that those protests have turned into, to use the NAACP president's quote, they've turned into this white spectacle, and I think they're detracting from a message of racial unity. And let me also say, I mentioned the bill I co-authored in the House. It was actually, I worked in collaboration with Tim Scott, who really put the whole thing together. And to dismiss it as a partisan window dressing is not recognizing that he is actually the first African-American senator in the Republican Party to represent South Carolina since Reconstruction. He can tell you that, I came into Congress with him, he's a good friend, that since he was elected, we all get the pins to wear, right? Those are our security to get in and out of the Capitol Police to get to our buildings. He's been stopped no less than 8 times by Capitol Police as he's tried to access his office. That's absolutely unacceptable to me. So it's inappropriate to call this legislation window dressing, because he's earned it. He tells a story about when he was young, he was raised by a single mother, and he'd go to work and he'd come back high school years at midnight, and his mom would be waiting up. And he was, at the time, he's like, "Why are you waiting up? I'm going to be fine." He said now he understands it. He's been pulled over by police 18 times in the last decade. It's unacceptable to me. and don't call it window dressing.
Carolyn, what were your thoughts about the use of federal law enforcement in Portland?
Sure. So first of all, dozens of African American members of Congress would disagree with Congresswoman's last statement. Listen, we saw this coming when the president walked across the street and held up a Bible upside down after tear gassing protesters as a show of executive force when it was completely unnecessary. And he forecasted it when he said that he was going to send federal troops despite being asked to do so in areas. I definitely am in opposition to it. I think Portland shows that it actually escalated the violence that occurred in that community. And I would argue that it was intentionally done to do so, and would have liked to have had members of Congress take first alarm when we saw the president do that day in Lafayette Square. I'm obviously in opposition to it. I think that I have better trust in the constitutional power of states and their local law enforcement to deal with issues within their own community than to have somebody fly in from Washington, D.C. and try to tell them that they're doing it wrong. They're untrained and they don't know the landscape. So I am in opposition to it. And in terms of the Insurrection Act, I wouldn't have passed an amendment that says you merely have to inform Congress before you do something like that. I would have amended it to say you need congressional approval to do that, because it is such an important and aggressive action by the executive branch. You want to make sure that the constitutional system of checks and balances works effectively. It never works effectively if you just notify somebody that you're going to do something or that you already have done something. Congress needs to reassert itself more forcefully on this issue in terms of making sure you actually get their approval before taking such an aggressive and unwanted federal move.
I'm curious, that brings up, Jaime, in general, not just this instance, but in general, has Congress asserted itself enough regarding President Trump?
Well, I mean, the House voted to impeach him. I think every time.
What are your thoughts on that?
There's a new investigation taking place of the administration. So I don't know if I could look, if I had my druthers, I think we would pull back a tremendous amount of executive authority. I don't care who the president is. We have ceded so much authority over the years to the executive, which is one of the reasons when the president passed an executive order taking money out of a congressionally appropriated account to use on something that it was not designed for. I, again, crossed lines to pull that authority back under the purview of Congress. We're the ones, as a senior appropriator, where the appropriations is named in the Constitution as the responsibility of Congress, and for the president to redirect that money without congressional approval was inappropriate. So I voted for that checks and balance to pull that authority back, and I'll continue to do that. I think I'm not going to get into the partisan game. That's one of the frustrations I have, is the real checks and balances that the House could provide would be more appropriate if it wasn't specifically aimed at just winning elections. I mentioned the impeachment. One of the challenges with that was they didn't want to do it in a bipartisan fashion, which was really breaking precedent from the other impeachments that have taken place in this country. And I think it hurt their mission. We talked about this, I think, in the last time I was in before you all. I said, if they really want to do this, and I want to get to the bottom of this, let's do this in a fair way that's just and in the light of day, because I'm not afraid to vote where the evidence leads. And I think, unfortunately, both parties have really weaponized kind of the chairman's gavel. We've seen that happen in many different areas. And I think the American people are worse for it. That's why I'm not afraid to cross party lines, and I'm not going to toe anybody's line when it comes to protecting the Constitution and people's rights from that.
Carolyn, has Congress provided enough checks and balances?
No. They haven't. I've been talking about this for most of my academic career and 3 years on the campaign trail. If you look at the issue of impeachment, and I said in this editorial board interview 2 years ago that if there was evidence of impeachable offenses, would I vote for it? And I said, absolutely. What we see from my opponent is a lot of obfuscation and prevarication on the issue, and talking about process, and in waiting multiple times when asked directly to answer the question. And I think that's why people are tired of DC politicians. When people ask a question, they want an answer. The process that was in place on the issue of impeachment was one that was put in place by Republicans. And what they wanted us to do is to focus our attention on the process without the impeachable offenses. But it doesn't end there. If you look at the growth of executive power, it's not just impeachment. It's on the issue of trade. President Trump has waged a trade war that has cost consumers thousands of dollars each household, and that has led to a challenge with our farming industry where our federal taxpayer dollars had to bail them out because of the challenges that it posed. That should be the responsibility of Congress. And it's not just that, it's the rise in the number of executive orders under this administration, which again is done historically, but has increased under the Trump administration. And it is a partisan issue. If you look at impeachment, if you look at trade, if you look at the executive orders, what you have here are Democrats challenging the president in the actions that he's taken, and Republicans going along for the ride. And look at where we're at now. Where we are at now, months after impeachment, is an emboldened president who thinks he has a go-it-alone approach, and that go-it-alone approach is hurting our American democracy. And it's only a partisan issue because Republicans don't have the will to call him out on these actions. They are more concerned about a primary challenge or their own reelection than taking sort of account of what damage this is happening to our democracy. So my opponent mentioned the executive order on appropriations and how she spoke out about it. That's fantastic. Do you know the other time that the president tried to take money that had been appropriated? Ukraine. That's what led to the impeachment issue, and that's why he should have been impeached. He said it in the own tapes that he had. He said it from we heard firsthand accounts of what he was doing. That is a prime example of the president doing exactly what he did later, that at this point, my opponent decided to talk about. You can't pick and choose when you want to take a stand with this president. You have to consistently be vigilant and protect our democracy by upholding your oath of office and holding him to account. Because if you don't, this is what happens. If you allow him not to be removed from office and you don't vote for impeachment, he's talking to other world leaders about ways in which they can help his election. That's anti-democratic. We should all be outraged, and we shouldn't be confused by all these little side talks about process and things in which take us off our eyes off the ball.
Greg,
I'd like to think you called him to account.
Pardon me, Greg? I'm sorry, Greg?
Jamie, go ahead.
I would like to, my opponent brought up several different things. The one I really think is critical to Southwest Washington is China. This is one of the areas where I think the president has a valid point. Someone had to confront the Chinese Communist Party and their aggressive actions, not just to their own citizens, but to this country and our citizens. No one before him had dared to stand up to China, whether it was destructive trade practices. We're the most trade dependent state in the nation. My district is the most trade dependent in the state. And we were getting hurt by an unwillingness of the last administration to stand up. Theft of military innovation. These are taxpayer dollars, and this is money to protect and defend our country. China was stealing it. Infringement of our small businesses' intellectual property. This was one of the number one issues that people continue to hear about, was that I had a store right off of 78th Street. It was a family-owned company, and they called me and said, we put this product out there, and we have within days seen China copy it and put it online as their product, and we're losing money. Not to mention, I think, standing up to China with regard to its role in suppressing and manipulating the information surrounding COVID. So this is one area where I really truly believe someone had to stand up to China and say, this far and no more. I don't believe in starting trade wars, but I also don't believe it's fair and free trade to allow an imbalance that only benefits Chinese people to the exclusion of the American worker. So I think we have to stand up to China. I think we have to better secure our nation's supply chain. This is another area you saw during COVID where it's absolutely critical that we maintain manufacturing capability. Right now, when these other nations have shut down, we lost the ability. We couldn't produce PPE. We couldn't produce basic supplies, and China wasn't going to help us. I mean, they were busy hiding and covering up information. This is, again, why I really believe we need to bring that manufacturing capability back to Washington State, why we have to protect our hydro system, why we have to stand up for the American worker and the small businesses. You know, about a year and a half ago, because of the trade imbalance and because of, you know, nobody wants to start a trade war, but I had businesses in Southwest Washington come to me and say, you know, I might pay a little bit more for the steel drum, maybe in my barrel. But someone had to take the long view and not let China gobble up our resources. I had another company come to me. They're from Kalama. They have, you know, 200 plus employees, and they said, hey, we're not part of the bad actors. Can you help us get an exemption from the president's order with regard to this trade policy? And I went to work actually with a Democrat down in California, and we got this administration to recognize that Australian steel was critical to 400 plus jobs in Southwest Washington, and they exempted it. So, you know, I just truly believe that someone had to look out for the American worker, and that's one area where I think this president has a valid point.
But if Trump's trade war has been effective, and if the economy was booming, then why did taxpayers have to pay, I believe it's $36 billion in bailouts to American farmers?
Look, I think if we're going to level the playing field, you have to make sure. So I can't speak to the Midwest farmers, but I can speak to specialty crop growers, people who grow berries, people who grow cranberries, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries in Southwest Washington. And they've come to me and said, you have to help. And honestly, even though in the short term there could be it's a little bit more scary for someone to go toe to toe with China, we want you to do that so that in the long run, we're not completely edged out of the market. And that's actually, to me, on that issue, I really felt like I really stayed very close to our small businesses. Again, we're very trade impacted in Southwest Washington. And I would say 90% of them said to me, yes, we're nervous in the long run. We don't want to start a trade war, but we also need him and you to stand up for a more fair and equitable trade deal. And honestly, that's the hard stuff of legislating. You can't just, like I said, you can't plug and play representative here and just pick policies that sound good. It's actually a little more complicated than that. You have to know the people in this region, you have to know the businesses, and you have to be able to find where they want you to serve in a nuanced way. Interestingly, this district supported Donald Trump. I didn't vote for him in the last election. However, I also didn't approach him with an ideological axe to grind, which has allowed me, you know, like I said, to protect those trade jobs in Kalama, to make sure going forward, you know, I've worked also with softwood lumber and making sure that pulp and paper workers have more access to a protected work environment versus trading all those jobs, not just to China, but to Canada. I just think someone did need to pay attention to the American workforce and to our employers. And that's, you know, that's something I'm not going to apologize for.
And real quick, are you going to vote for Trump this year?
I am.
Okay. Carolyn?
Let me be very quick on the trade issue. Number one, this is our district, and one of the benefits of being in the district so often with my in-person town halls and now virtual town halls is I can really listen to what is on people's mind. So I think it's important to recognize that that listening part is key to what informs us when talking about policy. But on the issue of the trade issue and President Trump, Congress abdicated its constitutional responsibility over trade. There's no evidence that the trade war has actually addressed the problems of China and intellectual threat. Large agribusiness got billions of dollars in payouts, which is our taxpayer money, for the trade war that Donald Trump created with the acquiescence of Congress. Small farms, including small farms in our district, got peanuts. And they are most at risk of going out of business because of the trade war. And I think the Columbian did an article about this, saying that only $50,000 in subsidies had come back to our farmers. And I've spoken with a lot of farmers about how displeased they are with the fact that, once again, big corporations that support Republican candidates for Congress, including my opponent, get the benefits of taxpayer bailouts where smaller businesses do not. That is very clear. So unless we can see conclusively that this unwanted trade war has actually achieved the purpose, then I think that that's proof enough that we're heading down the wrong path on this particular issue. Why I'm so much against it, both in terms of the constitutional issue, that it doesn't fix the problem, and it puts smaller farmers at risk. And the other thing, and I'll stop here because time is of the essence, it is a hidden tax on consumers. Consumers are paying more for household goods because of this trade war. They may not know it because it's a hidden tax, but that is a tax increase that we are paying because of this trade war. And that is significant. We're talking about a time when people are in economic distress.
And Jamie, really quick, would the Trans-Pacific Partnership have helped hold China accountable?
You know, I never got to see the final version of that because it wasn't put out. So I was watching it. I was very anxious to see that it would. For my support of it, I needed to see that. But that was something that this president and Hillary Clinton refused to engage in. So it wasn't even put before Congress. So I can't tell you because I wasn't able to read it.
Yeah, I know by the time Trump took office, there was bipartisan opposition to it. It wasn't just Trump.
We never even got to see the final because nobody was going to bring it up. But let me say, if you know, small businesses here, farms here, I think, you know, you can talk about supporting them, but they've actually endorsed me in this race. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, which represents the small businesses here in Southwest Washington, the Washington Farm Bureau, both have supported me, and they represent small mom and pop farms up and down my 7.5 counties. And I feel like, you know, the proof's in the pudding.
Mm-hmm. Let's want to move on. Anyone else have a question?
Keep going. You're good. You're doing good.
Okay. I've got a whole list here.
I know you do.
Okay, so I'm curious. Because I saw something on Carolyn's website. I might have missed it, but I didn't see it on Jamie's. Jamie, first of all, do you believe that climate change is real, and is it exacerbated by human activity?
Absolutely.
What should Congress do about it?
Well, the first thing we need to do is protect our hydro system. And I know I sound like a broken record. And this is an issue that's been around for, you know, a long time. But this is the first time we've seen, you know, senior leaders in the congressional delegation go silent. And you've seen other leaders like the governor promote tearing out our hydro system. You know, to replace the hydro system along the Columbia Snake Rivers would require us to replace it with 16 coal-fired power plants. This is a carbonless energy source that I think is a model. In addition, we as ratepayers spend about almost $1 billion when it's all said and done to mitigate the impacts to our wild salmon, which I believe we should. I am a believer in protecting our wild salmon runs, making sure, you know, it's one of the reasons I applied the decision that was put together recently, because it allows for increased fill, it allows for more fish passage. That is such a hard thing for me to say, but it also protects the system. I do believe, you know, one of the things, I actually just sat down with a group of members and a White House official to push back hard on an executive order that he put in place with regard to some farm workers, people who plant trees. So one of the big initiatives of this administration is to plant 1 trillion trees to help with climate change, right? In terms of CO2 sequestration. We have a lot of small family tree farms in Southwest Washington. And if you've ever been onto their land, they're the cleanest for fish and habitat and the air, right? Well, because of the administration's order here, the people who actually plant those trees, or the people who work and support pulp and paper, or the machinery around that, are now not able to come, which is unacceptable to me. So we talk about holding this administration accountable. I'm there. I just am not going to do it in order to score political points at the expense of this president, because I didn't do that with Barack Obama. To my view, to the degree you're going to serve and support the interests, the economy, the people of Southwest Washington, we should do it. So full circle, yes, absolutely. I don't think anybody in our area can really deny that climate change is real. And we should be using, I think this is an area where I think Republicans should be forefront and center. You know, I have legislation that would provide money to change and look at and eradicate. I'm doing this with Derek Kilmer. Ocean acidification. We have a lot of shellfish growers up and down the coast that were interested in protecting our waters. You know, when the administration said they wanted to drill off of our coast, I was one of the first that stepped up and said, time out, that's just not going to work for us. I really believe that this is an area where we can use innovation, and we should harness the private sector to really advance cleaner, more innovative solutions when it comes to energy. But I think protecting our hydro system really tops out the list for this region's representative in this area.
Carolyn?
Climate change is real. I can't believe we have to say that in the 21st century. It is human caused, and we have to do what we can to combat it, which means relying on science and data. And one of the things that I think we should always do is look at what the science tells us, what the evidence shows us, and the directions that we should head in order to combat it. And there are multiple ways in which we can do it. Obviously, hydro is one source of clean energy. I'm very encouraged by the positions I've taken in the past on hydropower and talking about how we can manage our dams differently to increase dam flow and spill, to increase the salmonoids going over the river, to help our salmon populations. I'm very excited now that the federal dams have to keep the water at 68 degrees, which will help protect our salmon. But it is one of many other possible choices where we can pursue clean energy projects. And Southwest Washington, frankly, has been left behind in terms of clean energy. We see a lot of these projects in the Puget Sound area, and we need them here in Southwest Washington, because too often environmental reform and jobs are seen in tension when I think we need to invest in more clean energy, because that actually creates jobs. How would I do this? Well, I think narrower pieces of legislation to address the effects of climate change are not only more likely to be passed in Congress, they're much more likely to enjoy bipartisan support. So if we talk about managing our forests, I look forward to talking to representatives from both sides of the aisle in Georgia to speak about how we can do that, how we can incentivize our tree farmers to having the trees have a longer life cycle so that they can sequester carbon. I look forward to looking and to talking to people in North Carolina about how we can protect our ocean shores from both sides of the aisle. I think that we have to do it in that fashion in order to get something done as quickly as possible, rather than slogans like Green New Deal. Let's look at the actual policies and try to pursue them in a bipartisan way. I think that's very, very important. I also think we have to invest in our universities. Here in Southwest Washington, there are professors at Washington State University who are looking at solutions like burying carbon and what that can do in order to address carbon output. So it is a multifaceted problem. It's regrettable that it continues to be an area where Congress simply can't get its act together. And there's so much more that we have to do, but we have to ask ourselves, why is it that Congress hasn't been able to get its act together? Why are we still reliant on the fossil fuel industry? Why is it the fossil fuel industry keeps going into our rural communities and trying to produce things based on fossil fuels? Well, I think what we should do is start looking at the FEC reports of members of Congress and seeing where they get their corporate PAC money. If you get money from Chevron, if you get money from big banks, if you get money from health insurers, you're going to be more likely to listen to what they have to say than the people of Southwest Washington. I represent the folks of Southwest Washington. I'm constantly in the district talking to them and listening to them about the common sense solutions that we can do to combat climate change. And I approach this as a problem solver. That's what academics do. Tell me what the problem is. Let's identify it. Let's find solutions, and let's work as collaboratively as possible to actually achieve those solutions. And what I would call attention to is the fact that when the Republicans were in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, we certainly didn't see a lot of growth in climate policy or even the acknowledgement in climate change. So we have to do much more, and this shouldn't be something that we're just coming to lately, because an election is just around the corner.
Let me clarify a couple of things, if I may.
Sure.
Southwest Washington actually isn't in the dark ages with regard to energy. You know, the ports, I've helped support the Port of Vancouver that has a major player in the supply chain for wind turbines. And if you've been to the eastern part of the district in Klickitat County, the farmers there actually have wind turbines in their district, or in their farms, that helps produce a reliable, I shouldn't say reliable, but low cost energy that is part of the BPA system. You know, the wind doesn't always blow, but it is an increasingly important part of our energy portfolio, which I support. I support whether it's there's geothermal, there's solar, there's tidal. I'm all for finding the best technology possible, but I'm also for supporting our hydro system, which, in case you hadn't guessed, is a big deal to me. Keisha, but I do want to, since my opponent brought up AOC's Green New Deal, would she vote in favor of it?
No, I'm quite clear, and I have been for 3 years that I wouldn't. No.
That's good to know. I think that's important.
I've been on the record saying that I won't, and I think my answer reflected the fact that I think the best way of dealing with climate policy is doing it with narrower bills with bipartisan support.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that's an important thing for manufacturers here. Thank you.
Let's talk about healthcare. Carolyn, you've talked about a low deductible public healthcare public option that would protect pre-existing conditions. Now, how does that differ from Medicare for All, and would you support Medicare for All?
No, I have talked in my 46 in-person town halls, in the half a dozen of the ones that I've done online, and in my roundtables and my coffees with Carolyn, what my healthcare position is. So let me say it again, rather than have somebody take bits and pieces of what someone has said to try to manufacture a position. I am in favor of so the framework that I use to address healthcare is try to get healthcare coverage for as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, while preserving the element of choice and with an eye towards affordability. That has always been my position. So I am in favor of the Affordable Care Act, whereas the Republicans, including my opponent, have proudly voted to get rid of it without offering a viable replacement. And I have said that there are ways in which we can improve the Affordable Care Act. It's imperfect, but one of the most important things that the act does is that it protects tens of millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions. 50 million Americans are protected by the Affordable Care Act today and over the last several years. So whenever I hear that there's an action to try to repeal the Affordable Care Act, 50 million Americans should be shooken to their core because they are going to lose that protection. It is not just what Congress has done, or my opponent proudly saying that she wants to do so. It's the fact that they have now brought that issue to the courts. And they brought that issue to the courts in the middle of a global pandemic. And not only that, but Congress had the opportunity to provide additional subsidies for the Affordable Care Act for people in need, and my opponent voted against it during a global pandemic. But that is only the first step. What I'm in favor of is a low-cost public option. So if somebody chooses to do so, they can buy in government-provided health insurance, a Medicare-like program, if that's what they want. They are the ones who are choosing or electing to access it that way. They are funding it. That is tremendously different than Medicare for All. Why? Because if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. So you still have the element of choice. If you are happy with your private insurers, and some statistics show that people are, you can keep it. If you're not happy with it, you can buy into a public option provided by government if that's what you desire to do. And for others, they can have the Affordable Care Act as a way of getting access to health insurance. But most importantly, 50 million Americans are protected with pre-existing conditions. And they're also protected, and this is important because it contrasts with the Republican plan, they are protected from having their health insurance premiums increase if they want to be protected for those conditions. So that's my policy. It's been consistent. I've said it for 3 years now. I could not be more clear, but I would welcome any follow-up questions, Greg, in case I have not hit all of your questions on this issue.
No, thanks. But let's move on to Jaime.
I'm glad that you've changed course because you told the Daily News, Indivisible, Skamakawa, Vancouver, you told them all that you supported a Medicare for All plan. I'm glad to see that you've changed your ways on that. This district does not support a government takeover of healthcare. And let me say a couple things. You know, you talked about people with pre-existing conditions. You talked about 50 million people. And a passion of mine is healthcare because of those 50 million people, but also because of one. You know, my oldest child has a kidney transplant. She will forever be a part of the healthcare system. She has a pre-existing condition. I get my health insurance on the ACA. I would never vote to strip her or any person in my district's access to healthcare, which is why I've co-sponsored the Pre-Existing Conditions Coverage Act to make sure, even if the courts throw the ACA out, there is a way for people with pre-existing conditions to feel secure that they're going to continue to have access. But I got another number for you, 180 million. That's the number of people who still get their health insurance through union plans, through private plans, that would be thrown off their plans if we add a public option. Public options, basically the veggie care, the public option is the veggie care option of the Medicare for All burger. All of the calories.
Why would people be thrown off on a public option? They would be on Medicare for All.
I'm right here trying to explain it. So right now under the ACA, which is flawed and has to be replaced, we were told if you like your doctor, you can keep them. That's out of here because most ACA plans have narrow providers. We saw it happen in Clickitat County and Pacific County. Actually, I think in every county in my district. Over half of the people who were eligible before the ACA for insurance still have not signed up. Spiking premiums. Your premium, your deductible, or your copay has gone through the roof as a result of the ACA. Now, doubling down and adding a public option is going to exacerbate that. What they don't tell you is the way that a public option is funded is it would pay providers less. If you add it onto the ACA, the only way for it to make up, and here's the funny thing is, anybody who's watching this, Google it, because leading liberal Democrats, leading healthcare think tanks, leading left-wing policy experts will tell you that the way that they're going to achieve savings in the public option is by paying providers 15% less. Do you know what that leads to? It leads to the ACA on steroids. It means that providers are going to eventually drop those plans because they can only get underpaid for so many patients. So it's going to limit networks. And if you have a pre-existing condition, if you have a rare disease, if you have cancer, if your kid has juvenile diabetes and you need to go regularly to a doctor, you need to see the best doctor available. But what the public option is going to do is limit your ability to go to that doctor because you're only going to get put in the back of the line. It's not going to pay enough to cover the cost of your care. And what's going to be left is people, their premiums are going to continue to spike. Honestly, you don't have to take my word for it. If you do any research on the public option, it's the Democrats who hate it. You know, they hate it in favor of a Medicare for All plan. My vision for healthcare is actually we empower the consumer. We give them the choice, which is why I've supported things like expanding the use of HSAs, purchase of health insurance across state lines. I also believe we have to expand and strengthen the safety nets, which is why the ACE Kids Act that I championed is going to allow kids on Medicaid to see the highest quality doctor irrespective of where they live. I think my vision and my opponents here very much differs. I will say I believe her that her heart is to make sure people have access to health care. That's my heart. I want to make sure the people I serve, including my own kid, has access not just to health care. I want it to be worth the paper that it's written on. And under the ACA, right now, major providers in Clark County are no longer taking those government-paid, either the government-paid or the Medicaid plans because it has so broken the system. So doubling down with the public option, I mean, you may as well do what, a lot of Democrats have said, which is just be honest about the fact that the whole goal here is a glide path to Medicare for all. And again, those 180 million people who have employer-sponsored coverage, if you go the Medicare for all route, it's done. Medicare, as you know it, is done. You talk about the debt and the deficits. That's a $32 trillion price tag over 10 years alone.
But the report that came up with the $32 trillion price tag, how much did it say individuals would save over those 10 years?
I don't know.
I do know. It said that under the existing plan, the public would spend $34 trillion on healthcare. So that study that said Medicare for all would cost $32 trillion over 10 years, but that would actually save us money according to that study.
There's two built-in assumptions. The first one is that Medicare is cheaper than the private insurance. The reason that is the administrative costs are about 5% less is because Medicare, the government piece of Medicare exempts itself from the reporting requirements, right? And maybe it would do that across the board. That's fine. But what you just highlighted makes my point. The ACA is so flawed, you can't just fix it or double down by adding a public option because it's $34 trillion over 10 years. And in the midst of that,
that's not what I said. But
I mean, you said that existing law, which is the ACA, the law of the land, leaves us at $34 trillion
under the current system.
No. You just made my point. How am I wrong?
So.
I mean, honestly, Greg, you can't.
No, the point is that according to that study, Medicare for All would save money over the course of a decade.
Look, if you've ever seen the government be more efficient and more effective than what you see when the consumer is empowered, please.
I'm just telling you what the report said.
I didn't reference that report in my number. I can get you where I got my number from if you'd like. But that's the point, is we do have to do better than the ACA. It has failed. That's the problem. I support pre-existing condition protections. I crossed party lines in December to lower the cost of prescription drugs. This is one area where I think my opponents tried to beat me into a corner on healthcare. But because I truly believe in access, because I am not going to toe someone's party line, be it big pharma or insurance, you know, they've come after me because I wasn't willing to do so. And I think that's a key point too. No one can buy my vote. No one. And I think it's hypocritical to insinuate that because someone's giving me support to win this race, that somehow I'm beholden to them. My opponent should know better than anyone. Her spouse, until recently, worked for a drug company. Like,
okay, well, and let's move on, Carolyn.
Greg, I'd love to respond. Thank you. Let's first acknowledge who is in this room today, although we can't see them. Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Health, Anthem, Johnson & Johnson, pharmaceutical companies, all of them give corporate PAC money to my opponent, which is why she is so strongly against the Affordable Care Act and the public option, and why she tries so hard to obfuscate and make this a issue that is not mine by painting me as a Medicare for all, and then piling on with comments like, it's so nice for you to change your opinion. I pride myself on how often I've been out in the community talking to voters and stating my position. My position is clear. I think we have to fix the Affordable Care Act, and the public option, which is quite different from Medicare for All, provides yet another option if people choose to enter into it, and doesn't provide the risks that my opponent is talking about. I think that is really very important. But what we have here from my opponent are excuses and not a plan. We have heard for so long that the Republicans have a plan to replace the Affordable Care Act, and they don't. Instead, it has been under continued assault. They're even assaulting it from before we got to the court decisions by making it more difficult for people to access it, so then they can talk about how it's a failure. So I think my opponent needs to learn the difference between a public option and Medicare for All, and to review the hundreds of hours of tapes where I talk about this issue. But the important thing here is this. The health insurance company and big pharma do not want the Affordable Care Act. They do not want the public option. These are the people who are funding my opponent and have done so for tens of thousands of dollars. And what it's done is it's put public health at risk. So she can talk about her plan to protect pre-existing conditions and the bill that she's talking about, but not only does it not control the costs of health insurers for somebody who's got pre-existing conditions, I've got good news. She doesn't have to do it. You know why? Because the Affordable Care Act protects tens of millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions. That is one of the best things about that piece of legislation. It's been under assault by Republicans. It's under assault in the middle of a global pandemic. We should all be outraged by this and the absence of a plan from Republicans to actually replace it to care for people in need. 104,000 additional Southwest Washingtonians lost health care because they were unemployed. You can multiply that by many factors across America today. So you have people struggling with this public health crisis who are afraid to go to the doctor. That is unacceptable in our democracy. And I would ask voters this: who would you trust on health care? Someone like me, who talks about how pre-existing conditions are already protected, we're providing health insurance coverage for millions of Americans, we're looking at ways to give people additional choice while allowing them, if they want it, to keep their private insurance, or somebody who tries to change the conversation multiple times by speaking about these piecemeal efforts to address healthcare and miscasting what my position is. What the opponent is doing is what's called a political head fake. She wants you to look at something that I don't stand for, focus on that rather than focus on her records. So if she's in favor of continuing this assault on the Affordable Care Act and now continuing an assault on the public option, I will take that challenge every single day, because in the end, democratic reforms on healthcare saves lives, keeps us healthier, and will make us really get through this global pandemic rather than cutting it out from within, on the side, and above, which is what Republicans have done for the last 8 years.
Okay, Jamie, quick retort.
I would say that, you know, my opponent supports legislation. She's saying somehow that I am owned by Big Pharma. Well, if that was true, I wouldn't have crossed their number one priority to vote against them. And they then ran attack ads against me because of it. I don't toe anybody's line. She actually supports a $10 billion bailout for insurance companies a year. Do you know what's interesting is under the ACA, insurance companies are making more than they ever have. Who's really got their hands in the pockets? One of the reasons I don't like the ACA is because it ensures a guaranteed paycheck for private insurers, irrespective of the quality of their care or how much they're charging in premiums. I don't have to convince anybody in this district that it's flawed. Every single person has seen their premiums go through the roof. I don't think that that's it's not appropriate. It's not acceptable. And on my watch, I'm going to make sure that people have access to quality, affordable health care. Their pre-existing conditions are going to be covered. And I'm going to fight to make sure we lower the cost of prescription medications. I've introduced and continue to support the Safe Importation of Prescription Drugs from Canada Act that my opponent has said she opposes. The only reason I can think she opposes this is because Big Pharma helps support her retirement through her husband's account. Like, I'm not the one here who has a financial stake in making sure those companies prosper. What I have a financial stake in is making sure that the people in Southwest Washington can afford their medications, can afford to get insulin. You know, it's twice the price here in Washington State than it is in Canada. Why in the world are we bailing out insurance companies and Big Pharma? This is one area where I think the people in Southwest Washington continue to support me, because I'm not going to toe anybody's party line, yet I'm passionate about healthcare reform, and I'm not going to be okay with the status quo, which is the ACA. This is not this to me. This is a defining issue.
Greg, very quickly, you know, I think it's unfortunate in the 21st century that politics have gotten to the point where one's spouse is brought into a debate. I don't listen to my husband when he tells me I have to pick up my clothes from the bathroom floor. I've been talking about healthcare relief and relief of prescription drugs for 3 years on the campaign trail, and 10 years before that as somebody who studies public policy. So when somebody says that I'm listening to my husband and Big Pharma on this issue, I see that as really a thinly veiled sexist argument that I don't have my own mind. I've been working from the age of 12, supporting myself and my own retirement, and we have yet again another attempt by a DC politician to try to change the debate, to confuse, and to have people not look at their own terrible position on healthcare and on prescription drug relief. And let me say this. If the Congresswoman spent so much time on prescription drug relief, then why is it that we only got her support in H.R. 3 last year? Why did it take 9 years to get to that point? If this was a passion, if it was something that you so carefully were concerned about over the course of your congressional career, why is it that you do it now? I've got an answer for you. You changed your mind because you almost lost an election. It's okay to change your mind if you've changed your position. It's okay to change your mind if you've changed your position because you want to serve the people of South Washington. It is not okay. It is not okay to do it because suddenly you see that the polls are working against you and you understand that your position not to have pharmaceuticals.
Okay. Well, let's focus on policy. Jamie?
A question. Can I answer it?
Real quick.
First of all, that bill it didn't come before me until last year, right? But what did come before me was the Safe Importation of Prescription Drugs Act, which I crossed my party leaders to support. So I have been working on this when the Republicans were in charge and when the Democrats are in charge. Interesting thing I have found out, though, is party bosses of both parties do tend to support Big Pharma and big insurance, which is why I've consistently bucked my own party or the other party if it's in the best interest of Southwest Washington. I have the stripes to prove it. And I also think if you don't listen to your husband when he talks about healthcare, that's fine. I respect that. Me and my husband don't agree on everything. But don't then insinuate that somehow I listen only to Big Pharma. That's such a joke. Like, that's such a joke. My record proves otherwise. And I look forward to the chance to continue to work for Southwest Washington when it comes to protecting their health care.
Okay, I think that's enough on healthcare. Any other questions?
I think we covered a lot.
We're kind of going into serious overtime here.
Okay,
I'm
we'll
gonna go
move
on.
along then. Sorry,
I got a sitter I gotta
as a
get.
policy wonk, I could do this all day, but we should move on. So tell you what, take 2 minutes, give us your final pitch, why voters should support you, and we'll start with Jamie.
Thank you. Well, it has been the honor of my life to serve my home area in Southwest Washington. I grew up here. I went to Prairie High School, and I have enjoyed serving this area. It's really been the honor of my life. I've never taken my eye off the economy, and I'm going to fight tooth and nail to protect workers, to protect businesses, to lower the cost of healthcare, and to continue to fight on other issues important to this region, be it manufacturing jobs, protecting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, both the safety net on the Medicaid side and the trust funds on the other side. I'm not afraid to cross party bosses when it's in the best interest of the folks I served here. And I've been ranked as the #1 most effective lawmaker in Washington State by the Center for Effective Lawmaking. That's out of the House and the Senate. And that's because I've crossed party lines. I've worked with folks like Pramila Jayapal, who we don't agree on a ton of policy, to demand more PPE during this crisis from the feds. I've supported the Defense Production Act and bringing that manufacturing capability back to the United States for PPE, for COVID, for healthcare testing, but also the long-term supply chain with regard to prescription medications and other manufacturing capability. You know, it is uncertain what's going to happen politically in the future, but I've proven I can work with members of both parties, with presidents of both parties, to effectively pass legislation and to solve problems for people here. This place is unique. We are not dominated by one major ideology. What people really want, and what they voice time and again, is someone who's going to go to bat on their behalf, be it single moms, you know, the 10,000 plus single moms in Clark County who need help with childcare. I've introduced legislation and have supported legislation as early as last week to expand childcare options, to get more workers, to retain and to retrain them, and to get more facilities in this childcare desert. Two, small business owners who are just hanging on tooth and nail. You know, I spoke to the governor about one last night, actually it was yesterday in the afternoon, asking if there was a way we could allow this person to maintain his employees during this crisis. So I will go to bat. I know who to call and how to help to solve problems for people here. That's why the NFIB, the National Voice for Independent Businesses, Small Businesses, has endorsed me, why the Farm Bureau has endorsed me, why the Chamber has called me one of, there's 20 Republicans and Democrats that they've given the Hamilton Jefferson Award for bipartisan lawmaking. I could go on. I've gotten awards recently from the Children's Hospital Association for fighting for kids' access to health care. And those are the things that when voters go to check their box, I ask that they remember. And I ask them for their vote. It is the honor of my life to do this job. Continuing to serve my communities in Southwest Washington is what I'm energized to keep doing. And with that, thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you, Jamie. Carolyn?
Hi, thanks. Thank you so much for doing this. As I said at the very top of the hour, so nice to see two candidates side by side airing their views. And I truly hope that my opponent will agree to debate me in a series of debates throughout the district so we can give the people of Southwest Washington this very important opportunity. Listen, I'm not a career politician. I'm an academic, I'm an educator, and what I've done in the last several years is show the people of Southwest Washington that I am present, accountable, and committed to listening to them and to working hard for them every single day. It's why I held 46 in-person town halls throughout the district, why we're doing them now online on Facebook, so people can see through my voice what I represent and how I'm fighting for them. And I think that's really important that people remember that, rather than what ultimately happens in political campaigns is you get a few jabs in, you put a few $1 million behind an ad, and you can't really see who the person is. I am so proud of the grassroots campaign that I've grown here in Southwest Washington, with the overwhelming majority of my funding coming from the state of Washington and most of it in the district. I'm also so proud not to have taken a dime of corporate PAC money when my opponent has taken millions. And the reason why that matters is if you look at an FEC report and you see a lot of money coming from Blue Cross Blue Shield, Aetna, Johnson & Johnson, Wells Fargo, big banks, then it gives you a clear idea why people are voting on particular issues. I only want to be beholden to the people of Southwest Washington. And what I'm presenting to you is somebody who is a problem solver, somebody who's an independent thinker, somebody who's going to look at all the unintended consequences of policy, and somebody who's committed to bipartisanship and working across the aisle now, not just when it's politically convenient. I ask that the voters look at my policy positions on the web, come to one of my town halls, come to many of my coffees with Carolyn to find out who I am and what I'm about, and not the caricature that people like to think a Democrat is. And let me end on this. I think the most important responsibility of a member of Congress is, number one, to be beholden to their oath of office and to hold the executive branch into account to make sure that it doesn't overstep its bounds. So I want to make sure that we are always taking a look at what the executive branch is doing and calling it out if it is overstepping those bounds and not being complicit in what I see is an abuse of executive authority. And second, to ensure a safe and functioning democracy. We are so fortunate in Washington state to have safe, secure vote by mail. There's so much that we need to do in terms of having democratic reforms to make sure that this is extended throughout the country. I'm stunned that more members of Congress aren't standing up and really calling for this because, frankly, our democracy is at risk. I want to earn your vote. And if in Congress and I vote in a way that you don't like, my vow to you is I will come back in a town hall or a coffee. I'll look you in the eye. I'll tell you why I voted the way I did. And I'll give you the opportunity to persuade me that I'm wrong. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to fly in occasionally. I'm going to be here in the district listening to you. I hope I can earn your support.
Great. Well, Carolyn and Jamie, thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks
Thanks
you
for your
guys.
time.
Thanks very much.
And good luck the rest of the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.